Welcome to a conspiratorial mood. In this video, I'll be discussing Jaen Roberts and the Seth Material. The first time I heard of the Seth Material, it was after watching Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal. While I was enthralled by its eerie soundtrack and its confusing and spooky mysticism, I didn't really have any idea what happened in the movie. So I went to Wikipedia and I discovered it was heavily influenced by something called the Seth Material. This name wasn't familiar to me, so I quickly clicked the blue link. Thus began a lifelong fascination with Jaen Roberts and the interdimensional being that she supposedly channeled, called Seth. Part 1. Jaen Roberts' background. Jaen Roberts was born in Albany, New York in 1929 and grew up in Saratoga Springs, New York. Her parents divorced when she was 2, and as a result she spent much of her childhood living with her maternal grandparents. Her mother suffered from severe rheumatoid arthritis and as a result was unable to work. In addition to this, her mother seemed like a terrible person who psychologically abused her poor daughter, often blaming her daughter's birth for her own illness, even going so far as to blame Jaen on one occasion for a suicide attempt. For most of her childhood and adolescence, Jaen was forced to live off of inconsistent government welfare. This situation made even worse by her mother's neglect. Her adolescence also included a spell in a strict Catholic orphanage, during a period in which her mother was hospitalized. This was said to be Roberts' first real introduction to religion, finding the solace and love in Christianity which she so sorely lacked in other parts of her life, and by all accounts became quite a fervent Catholic, although she would later distance herself from religion in her adult life. Despite all these hardships, Jaen would prove to be a very accomplished writer in her youth, winning a scholarship to Skidmore College at the age of 16. Although her work would later become eclipsed by the Seth Material, of course, it is worth noting that she wrote successfully across a number of genres, and even had the honour, if you can call it that, of being the only woman invited to attend the first science fiction writers' conference in 1956. However, I couldn't find definitive proof that she actually attended. Given her success as a writer then, it seems quite disappointing that the work she would be most remembered for is one that she herself didn't even claim authorship of. Part 2. The Origins of Seth. Jaen Roberts' channeling seems to trace its origins to an epiphany she had on a September evening in 1963. While working on some poetry, she suddenly experienced, in her own words, a fantastic avalanche of radical ideas, going on to say that the new ideas burst into my head with tremendous force. It was as if the physical world were really tissue paper thin, hiding infinite dimensions of reality, and I flung through the tissue paper with a huge ripping sound. I personally don't find that tissue paper makes that loud of a ripping noise, but we'll give her some poetic license here. When Jaen came to, as she described it, she found herself titling this collection of notes as The Physical Universe as Idea Construction. It is worth noting that at the time Roberts described the evening prior to that moment as, quote-unquote, very unpsychedelic. Although Jaen's work had occasionally touched upon supernatural themes, she hadn't taken a personal interest in the supernatural or the extrasensory until now. Her and her husband Robert began dabbling in things beyond the earthly realm. I guess being quite enterprising and wanting to turn their newfound hobby into a side business, I'm guilty of that myself, the couple approached the publisher about writing a do-it-yourself book on extrasensory perception, and landed the contract. This new project led to the two experimenting with a Ouija board as research for the book. Although initially the sessions were relatively unremarkable, that would all change on December 2nd, 1963, when they began to receive coherent messages from a male individual who identified himself as Seth. While initially they communicated through the board, eventually the sessions progressed beyond that, ultimately with Jaen entering a trance-like state and being possessed by the entity Seth, taking on different mannerisms and speech patterns, these sessions being transcribed by her husband Robert. Soon the couple had begun amassing a considerable amount of material. Still somewhat in disbelief in regards to the channeling episodes, the couple sent some of the writing sessions to a psychologist with an interest in reincarnation. His eventual response was that the material was likely coming from Jaen's subconscious, and warned them that amateur mediumship could potentially lead to mental health problems. Although initially disappointed by this conclusion, Jaen continued. She stated, "Because we were so innocent about psychic literature, we weren't hampered by superstitious fears about such phenomena. I didn't believe in gods or demons, so I didn't fear them. I wanted to learn. Rob and I had discovered a whole new world together, and so we were going to explore it. She stated, I was doing twice the creative work I had done earlier. I was satisfied with the quality of the Seth material. It was far superior to anything I could do on my own. If nothing else, I thought the sessions presented a way of making deeply unconscious knowledge available on a consistent basis. Part 3. Seth explained. According to Jaen, Seth described himself as an energy personality essence no longer focused in physical matter, which is what I say about myself whenever I see an embarrassing photo from secondary school. Despite initially not considering Seth a distinct identity, over time Jaen seemed to become more accepting of Seth as a separate consciousness. When speaking as Seth, Jaen adopted a deeper voice with different mannerisms, although her accent and syntax did not notably change, in contrast to other supposed channelers throughout history. While a number of other people have claimed to have also channeled Seth, he supposedly had at some stage stated through Jaen, communications will come exclusively through Rupert at all times to protect the integrity of the material, which is pretty convenient. Rupert was Seth's pet name for Jaen, in case you were wondering. Part 4. Seth's teachings. Seth's teachings would prove to be very influential on the New Age movement in America, some seeing the Seth material as a foundational text for American spiritualism. The main element of Seth's teachings was the idea that consciousness creates matter, and that the individual could directly impact reality by their own thoughts and beliefs. I'm sure you've heard some version of thoughts become things from an annoying aunt who is very into crystals and multi-level marketing. Well, you have the Seth material to thank for that. In addition to this, Seth also touched on the idea of the self not being a single monolithic entity, but a collection of various souls overlapping from different diverse realities, both past and present, with reincarnation being integral to this. Coincidentally, again, this is what I say whenever somebody brings up something embarrassing I did in secondary school. One strange quirk to Seth's teachings in a New Age context was the incorporation of Christianity into his teachings, claiming that Jesus Christ was a highly evolved entity who exists in different realities, and this Christ entity existed as three individuals throughout our history: John the Baptist, Jesus of Nazareth, and Paul of Tarsus. I personally think this incorporation of Christianity was key to the Seth material's success during the 70s and 80s, and likely goes somewhat towards explaining its increasing irrelevance now, as I assume less and less New Age spiritualists would consider the inclusion of Christ as a useful entry point, and instead maybe see it as a hurdle towards believing any of this claptrap. For a period of 21 years, Jaen Roberts claimed to consistently channel Seth in over 1,500 sessions, only stopping the year before her death in 1984. Jaen Roberts published well in excess of 20 books relating to Seth, ranging from direct transcriptions to poetry and fiction inspired by Seth's teachings. All of these works collectively are known as the Seth Materials. Part 5. My conclusion. My own thoughts on the matter are that Jaen Roberts was a very prolific and interesting writer. I personally don't think she was attempting to perpetrate any great ruse or fraud upon people. I believe she simply was unsure where the Seth materials were coming from, and eventually settled on the conclusion that it was some form of supernatural entity, which wouldn't have been my personal conclusion. However, for me, there are many elements within the Seth material which seem to reflect Jane's own background, such as her Catholic upbringing. Although I've only read a limited amount of the Seth material, it's largely inscrutable and vague, a hodgepodge of Eastern and Western philosophies stitched together. I believe that you can pretty much project as much meaning as you want onto the text. Ultimately, I have a personal dislike for New Age spiritualism, and believe it is mostly, unfortunately, used by snake oil merchants attempting to persuade people going through a hard time that if they just buy their book and special crystals and disengage from the world around them, everything will be okay. Having said that, I'd love if you bought my new crystals and wellness book. Sorry, I meant like and subscribe. I'd like you to like and subscribe. I really appreciate the small number of people that watch these videos, and I quite like making them. So if you also have any suggestions for videos you might like to see, please leave them in the comments below. Also, if you think somebody might like these videos, please share it with them. That would be nice. Okay, see ya.